Hello and welcome to Module 41, which is about wastewater and from humans and livestock. All right, so wastewater. If we talk about wastewater and livestock, we're think of like cattle or sheep or I don't know, usually cattle, but think of like a farmland. And so that runoff from that farmland is going to go into the waterways. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. And that often occurs with livestock. So it's just wastewater from maybe cattle yards or something along those lines. And so that runs off, and you can see it over here in this picture. So you can see runoff occurring here. I'm not sure what it is, but it's running off into this waterway, and so there's two types. There's point, which is coming from a single source, like you can see in the picture. There's definitely a point source pollution right here, so it's definitely coming from one particular area. Whereas non-point is from a variety of areas. So think of the Redding area. So all the pollution that might go into the river is probably not coming from one particular source. There's probably not a pipe that's flowing into the river, but it's just runoff from a variety of different areas. So that's called non-point, and you can see that in this picture. You can see a bunch of different things. There's not a particular pipe that's running into the river, but it's just the combined runoff from the land. And so that would be non-point. So point's source is pretty obvious, pretty easy to, not easy to fix, but easy to pinpoint where it's coming from and who to contact. But non-point is very, very difficult because it's not coming from a particular source and it's not easy to see. And that's actually our biggest concern is the non-point. Because once again, that's almost like tragedy of the commons. So all of these runoff combined is a big deal. Maybe one on its own is not, but they're all using this land and all ultimately using this river. But no one is generally held responsible like they would be in this picture here. So once again, we come back to tragedy of the commons for that non-point source pollution. All right, so environmentalists are concerned for three reasons. So, one, wastewater undergoes decomposition, so the things that are going into the water decompose, and they create a lot of demand for O2. So, as things are decomposing, a lot of oxygen is used, and if oxygen is used, that means there's less oxygen for living organisms like fish. Also, nutrients are released. So if there's excess fertilizer going into the water, those nutrients are released and they can, in a sense, fertilize the water, and you can get algal blooms, which is really bad because um, at first you might think that's good. You've got all this algae growing. But what happens is once the fertilizer runs out, the algae dies. And when it dies, now you're back to number one, which is the decomposition. And so that takes a lot of oxygen out of the water and reduces it for the organisms that are there. And then three, it says can carry a wide variety of disease-causing organisms. So, of course, there's Giardia, E. coli, all kinds of things that can be in the water because of runoff. All right, so our major pollutant source is wastewater. So that's the majority, and that could be from runoff from farmlands, or it could just be from sewage, things like that. So a variety of things: sewage, gray water, which is water that would be used for like your sink, washing dishes, laundry, that kind of stuff, and then livestock. So basically, it uses oxygen. So as those things break down, oxygen's being used to break it down, so that decreases the amount of oxygen that's available for organisms. And so we refer to that as BOD, which is biochemical oxygen demand. So on Monday and Tuesday, we'll do a lab about this. And so you guys actually, when you did the dissolved tablets, the dissolved oxygen, when you tested the water a couple weeks ago, I told you that we weren't going to do the BOD test. We will eventually do that when we go to the river. So we'll test the river and see what the biological oxygen demand would be for the river. And so down below at the bottom here, you can see a pristine river would be 1 milligram per liter. So hopefully Sacramento River will be that. And then a polluted river is 2 to 8, treated sewage 20, and raw sewage is 200 to 600. So hoping that it's not that, but it shouldn't be. It should be within the pristine river. Maybe if we got down farther south, like if we were to get to Sacramento and test the water, we might see that maybe it's a little bit higher than it would be here because we're kind of at the start of the river. So I would expect it to be pretty pristine. All right. So what happens with areas? I said that if there's lots of nutrients in the water, it can create an algal bloom, and so that's kind of what you're seeing in these two pictures, or an algal bloom. And so at first, it's okay because algae produces oxygen, but then what happens is the nutrients run out. And so when the nutrients run out, the algae dies and then it decomposes, and that increases. Decreases the amount of oxygen that's available. Also, what this can do when it's growing is, let's say that this is the ocean and you have corals or things that are attached to the bottom and they can't move. And so, if you've got algae blooming across the surface, it's blocking light. And so it's blocking light for things that are below it. So that can be a problem for things that are attached, like plants or coral. Fish can just move, but then eventually, when this starts to decay, it's going to decrease the amount of oxygen, and so the fish aren't going to be able to survive, and they'll have to move on, which is going to be difficult because it's probably their habitat. It's probably their ecosystem that they're having to abandon. All right, so there's over 400 in the world, so over 400 dead zones, meaning that there's not really anything that is living because there's so much nutrient runoff into the water that really nothing is living except for the algae bloom, which is not good. All right, so we call that cultural eutrophication. So that is just anthropogenic, meaning that it's formed from humans. And eutrophication is excess nutrients. That's all that refers to. That will pop up. That term anthropogenic will pop up all the time on the AP test. And then eutrophication, you'll probably see that. And so that's just excess nutrient runoff. And that's for pollution in the waterways is just an excess in nitrogen and phosphorus. And that's generally from runoff from farmland. So let's say that they're over fertilizing, that runs off into the river, and now we've got eutrophication, and that would be cultural, meaning that it's from humans. And that would cause the algal blooms, and then eventually things die as it decomposes and produces those dead zones. Oh, and I'm blocking the picture down here. But you can see down here, there's runoff, and it's creating this algal bloom down here, which is not a good thing at all for this waterway. All right, so let's see here. Let me move my little picture. So different diseases. I mentioned that some of the diseases from wastewater, mostly human, like sewage. We can get cholera, hepatitis, gastrointestinal illness, flu type symptoms, and that's from E. coli is a really common one. That's from really poor water conditions. So if we look at these water conditions, these pictures down here, it's pretty poor water. It's actually really disgusting, but it's really common, which is sad in especially developing countries. It's very, very common. And then if we look at the world population, so we've got about 8 billion, close to 8 billion people on Earth, 7.6. 2.1 billion don't have access to clean water. That's quite a bit of people that don't have access to clean water. It would be half in China and India. That's quite a bit of people. And this is very typical of what their waterways look like. And a lot of times people are washing their dishes in water that looks like this, getting drinking water from it, swimming and bathing in it. And you get that in your mouth, and now you're very, very sick. And the leading cause of death in the world is not access to clean water. So it's pretty sad. Let's see here. So 361,000 children die each year from poor drinking water. That's quite a bit. And a lot of it has due to E. coli. So the cholera is very common, like I said, hepatitis. But E. coli causes excessive vomiting and dehydration. And so kids are more susceptible to that because they're smaller bodies. And so they just don't deal well with being dehydrated and sick like that. And so that's usually from human waste. And often we hear about E. coli there's a recall on lettuce or strawberries or things in the US. And that's because we get produce from developing countries like Mexico and places that maybe don't have good water. And that's why you can't drink the water when you go to Mexico. It's just because it's not treated properly. And so our bodies, especially from the US, we're not used to that. And so if there's anything in the water, it can make us very sick, especially if there's human waste in the water. That would make anybody sick. But it's generally because of sewage contamination, which is kind of gross. All right, so ways to treat sewage. So if it's just a rural house, so out in the country, let's say, they would be treating their own water. So you can see here, if you have a sewage, like if you have a septic system at your house, which if you guys live outside the city limits, it's pretty common to have a septic system around here. We have a lot of rural areas. So you can see all the pipes drain into the septic tank. The septic tank breaks down. There's enzymes and things that break down the sewage. And then it needs to be pumped every 5 to 7 years or so. And then there's this area where the top, not the solid material, but there's this leach field. And so it's kind of the water is leached out. And then when it gets to be too much sludge, is what they call it in here, the like solid material, then they pump that out. But otherwise, this water is leached back into the soil below, where you are. So it's not like on the surface or anything. And then by the time it gets down into the groundwater, it has been filtrated. So the ground will naturally filtrate the water. All right. So advantages is that there's no electricity needed. You're able to take care of your own house in your rural area. Disadvantages is there's not a lot. I mean, you have to have a fairly large septic system if you have a fairly large house. And then you have to have the leach field and you have to have other things. It has to be pumped often, 5 to 10 years or so, and maintained. And so if there is a problem, it's very expensive to dig it up and take care of it. So there's advantages and disadvantages. And then if we look at a sewage treatment plant, so this video will show you a little bit how that works. The advantages is it takes care of a large city, so an urban area. And the sludge often is used as fertilizer. So that's a good advantage. Disadvantage is that they often use chlorine and things to treat the water. And so that's the water is being treated. And it could contain chemicals and things. They are here in Redding at the Clear Creek water. They are very, very careful because it goes right back into the river. And so they do test it to make sure it doesn't have, they treat it with chlorine, but then they treat it, and I can't remember what it is, but they treat it with something that takes the chlorine out before it goes into the river. But there is a chance of contamination for sure, but they test it all the time. So anyways, here's how it works. I'll play a little video for you guys.
It's a topic we'd rather not think about. Where does last night's dinner go when we flush it down the drain? While you may already be grossed out just thinking about it, this question leads way to a significant subset of civil engineering and a massive amount of public funding. Just like all dogs go to heaven, all drains in a city lead to a wastewater treatment plant where that wastewater gets turned back into water that we can drink. Now, you may be thinking that you'd rather just let bygones be bygones and not think about this nasty part of real life. But here's the thing. Chances are you've drunk water that was waste at some point, so you might want to take some time to understand this engineering process that makes dirty water clean. Here's where it starts. The toilet. Once you're done doing your business and flush that magical handle, your waste ends up at the inlet of one pretty interesting place, a wastewater treatment plant. Why is this place so interesting? Because it takes arguably one of the most disgusting substances in the world and turns it back into something that is essential to all life. Flushing just your toilet at halftime may not seem like a big deal, but when you couple it with thousands, if not millions, of others doing the same, it can result in some pretty high sewage flow rates. New York City has an array of 14 wastewater treatment plants that handle a combined 1.3 billion gallons of wastewater daily. That's enough wastewater to fill the Dead Sea with pure sewage in just 8 years. And that's just New York City. There are an estimated 14,748 treatment plants in the US alone that 76% of the USA's population relies on, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers. Understanding wastewater is crucial to understanding the critical infrastructure needed to support modern life. That brings us to the first step of the process that handles larger items in sewage, things like flushable wipes, 2x4s, toys, or even guns. You name it, and it's probably been caught in a bar screen. Bar screens are exactly what you would think. They are large vertical bars that stand at the inlet of nearly every wastewater treatment plant, designed to stop larger items from getting to the plant and hurting machinery like pumps. This first process where bar screens are used is commonly referred to as pretreatment. The sole intention of pretreatment is to remove the outliers in the sewage and make the whole mixture a little more homogeneous, or slightly less chunky. Bar screens are typically mechanically raked at certain intervals, depending upon the flow rates of the water treatment plant, although some older plants will still have more manual removal processes. Whatever is removed from the bar screens is then sent off to your average landfill or solid waste handling facility. Or, in the case of unusual items such as guns, they're sent off to the evidence locker in a police station to be investigated. Next up is the grit chamber. Grit chambers are the next steps in the pretreatment process following bar screens. Since these bars don't catch everything, larger particles called grit still need to be removed from the sewage as it is made even more homogeneous. As the sewage flows into the grit chamber, the velocity of the rather viscous sewage is adjusted to allow for particles of sand and rock to settle out. This is needed because these particles can't be removed using chemicals, and they could potentially clog or destroy pumps later on in the process. There are 3 types of these chambers: horizontal grit chambers, aerated grit chambers, and vortex grit chambers, which all accomplish the same task using slightly different methods. Following the grit chambers, the sewage will move on to the primary treatment process, which starts with a large basin called a primary clarifier. Primary clarifiers, and clarifiers in general, function on the principle of settling velocity. This term can be defined simply as the speed at which a particle settles. For wastewater being pumped into clarifiers, it's important that the flow rate of the water being pumped in doesn't exceed the settling velocity of the particles trying to be removed. In order to accomplish this, engineers will vary the size and number of primary clarifiers in accordance with the plant's permitted sewage flow rate. This ensures that at varying flow levels, solids can settle out of primary clarifiers to the correct quantities. At this step in the process, the slightly treated wastewater, which is referred to as effluent, is free of solids larger than 10 micrometers and should be all organic matter, which will be treated further. The top layer of the clarified water flows over a weir wall and into the next basin in the process, called the aeration basin. Now begins the process of secondary treatment, the sole focus of which is to significantly degrade the biological content of the sewage. In many cases, this process starts with aeration basins. Effluent flows into the aeration basins, at the bottom of which are hundreds, if not thousands, of tiny air blowers that create bubbles through the water. The water is pumped into this tank along with something called return-activated sludge. You can think of return-activated sludge as a bunch of happy little bacteria that get to eat their favorite foods all day long. This introduction of significant amounts of bacteria along with the massive amounts of oxygen injected from the bubblers creates an environment perfect for the process of aerobic digestion. Summarized simply, it's the breakdown of organic matter along with the use of excess oxygen. Some older plants will add in another step before aeration basins referred to as biofilters or trickling filters. Found in many older plants, these filters essentially trickle the effluent over a medium like stone or plastic and allow for a film of bacteria to chow down on any organic matter in the water. This step is largely not used in newer plants due to more efficient and effective modern processes. But for plants with basins already installed, many still use them because they only benefit the treatment process in most cases. Following aeration basins, the effluent along with much of the sludge is pumped into a secondary filter or clarifier, where some of the sludge is removed and pumped back into the aeration basins as the return-activated sludge. Further settling of larger particles is also accomplished in these basins, as it is the final step of the process that will remove solids and larger biological matter. Water flows out of secondary clarifiers over a nearly identical weir wall to the primary clarifiers and moves on to the disinfection process. At this point, 85% of all organic matter is removed from the water, and the effluent should be safe to drink in most cases, although you probably wouldn't want to. Disinfection is the final step of the process and is usually accomplished in one of 3 ways, either through chlorine, ozone, or ultraviolet disinfection. Each process has its benefits and drawbacks, with each being used commonly throughout the wastewater treatment process across the world. Chlorine disinfects the water through chemical disinfection. Chlorine, which you can think of as concentrated bleach, is added to the effluent here to kill off any remaining bacteria and organisms still living in the water. When chlorine is added to kill off the bacteria, it then has to be removed before it can be discharged, as to not kill off anything in the discharge location. After this, the water is safe enough to discharge into a stream or lake. Ozone disinfection is another method of disinfection that involves pumping an electrical current through the water that causes oxygen molecules, O2, to disassociate and combine with a free oxygen molecule, forming O3, known as ozone. Ozone is an incredibly strong oxidant and causes microbes' cell walls to leak, rapid cell decomposition, and overall damage to cells. In other words, it kills off bacteria. The last common method uses ultraviolet light to scramble bacteria's DNA so that they cannot multiply. In UV disinfection, the bacteria in the water aren't killed, rather they're sterilized, rendering them harmless. If you were to ingest water with living microbes immediately following UV treatment, any harmful bacteria would be unable to multiply or render your body damage. Engineers choose between these methods based on a variety of factors such as flow rates, cost, and location of discharge, which brings us to the final step: effluent release. Effluent release exists in one of two forms. In most cases, the now treated water is released back into a stream or lake or other water source. In rare cases, usually in areas where water is scarce, the effluent discharge from a wastewater treatment plant can be discharged into another treatment plant directly, where it will be treated further for consumption. This is referred to as full-cycle water reuse. From a chemical perspective, the final drinking water is the same as normal treated water that flows through your pipes now, but due to the connotation of your drinking water being sewage just days before, this treatment process is normally shied away from or not heavily publicized. The entire process of wastewater treatment takes on average 24 to 36 hours from when a drop of water enters to when it leaves. Each wastewater plant will receive a permit for flow rates, chemical levels, and effluent quality, among other things, from the EPA that outlines the necessary treatment for a plant. Wastewater plant operators will make adjustments to a plant's operation and constantly measure levels to ensure proper discharge and proper treatment. Without these operators and the dirty job that they do around the clock, our sewage would always stay sewage, and sanitation in modern cities would be much, much worse. Wastewater treatment is an essential dirty job, and you can thank the 14,748 treatment plants in the US alone for not having to worry about what happens when you flush.
All right, so it's pretty amazing. And if you're able to tour the Clear Creek Water Facility in normal non-COVID years, we do. It is exactly the same. So it's exact same process here in Reading as you saw in the video. So it's pretty cool. And that is it. So hopefully you enjoyed, and I will see you next time.